So, Renato, is Michael Cohen's testimony the nail in the coffin for Trump?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a tweet. So, Asha, we got the massive trial happening right now. Former president of the United States. I know some of you have commented on YouTube. You're like, what about other cases? It's like, well, right now, there's so much interest in this trial. It's capturing international attention. Very hard not to be focusing our episodes on this ongoing criminal trial of Donald Trump.
Yeah. And last week, we had star witness Stormy Daniels, and we talked about her testimony. And this week, it's Michael Cohen. And I think he's kind of the most interesting witness to talk about, right? Because for a long time, I think even when you and I talked about this case, a big question about whether this case should be brought rested on the fact that it would kind of hinge on Michael Cohen's testimony and whether he could really carry the case for the prosecution because of potential credibility problems given his prior convictions. So what do you think?
Wow. Well, it's a big question. I mean, and certainly just to lay out the credibility problems here for a minute, convicted of lying to under oath to Congress, convicted of fraud, somebody who has made numerous statements that are admittedly false. In fact, he has said that the crime he pled guilty of, he did fraud, that he didn't actually do it. He's walked that back. He's also somebody who clearly, I would say it's fair to say, is an axe to grind against Trump. And he's actually making a living right now off of his attacks on Trump, right? He's on every podcast imaginable, television show, radio show. He's all over the place. A lot of you potentially listen to podcasts that he either hosts or is part of. And that just gives tons of fodder for cross-examination. And I guess here's how I would think about this, and we can delve into more depth, but I'm going to set a framework for this, okay? Cohen is testifying on a lot of different points. He's actually narrating the case for the prosecution. One issue at a trial is that it's not like told as a story the way that it does when you watch a movie or you watch a television show where they effectively narrate the case for you. There's no narrator. And so really a bunch of witnesses come in, a bunch of exhibits come in, and it's hard for the jury to piece it all together. I view Michael Cohen as the connective tissue between all of these different pieces for the prosecution. And then the other thing that's happening here is Michael Cohen on certain points is backed up by other things, either testimony by other people, backed up by documents, backed up by emails. In one case, of course, famously a recording. So the prosecution is leaning into that and putting all that stuff on and showing you that Michael Cohen is backed up on all these things. What that obscures is the fact that on very key points, Michael Cohen's backed up by no one other than his own say-so. And so he's putting words in the mouth of Donald Trump. He's putting words in the mouth of Alan Weisselberg, who's not testifying. And the prosecution is relying heavily on those statements on some key points. But I really think the question is, will the jury even focus on that? Will the defense be able to get them to focus on that? Because Cohen is talking about so much. He's supported by so much in so many points. And you can expect this cross-examination to go after him on so many points.
Yeah, I wonder, given you're talking about the story, is it worth doing just a quick, kind of Wayne's World flashback to the origins of all of this and, the how Michael Cohen, remember, I think it's just worth kind of rehashing a little bit because I don't know if you remember, that was the first time I used my Nuclear Elmo meme on Twitter was when the FBI executed a search warrant on Michael Cohen's house. That was like mic drop moment. That was mic drop.
Huge.
That was huge. That was like August of 2017. It was like really at the beginning of all this. And through the course of that and I believe that was a case that had been handed over to the public corruption squad at the Southern District and FBI. They executed a search warrant, and he was charged with these crimes. And this is where he pleaded guilty to making this payment, right? And that's also where the non-prosecution agreement came from against AMI in terms of all these facts that they stipulated to. And the big issue there was was the Southern District ever going to bring these charges against Trump? Because Michael Cohen stood in open court and said that he made these payments at the direction. Did he name Donald Trump? I believe he did in open court.
Yeah. He did. What happened was the Southern District of New York didn't want him to name Trump. They actually wrote around the fact that Trump was implicated.
And he was individual one.
Right. And they basically, in the factual basis, when they were going through what's called the change of plea hearing, where he was pleading guilty, the prosecution went out of its way not to ask Michael Cohen questions that would really focus on and point the finger at Trump. They wanted the focus to be on Cohen and not create a political brouhaha, since they were part of the executive branch and Trump was president at that time. But nonetheless, Cohen took it upon himself to do that. Right.
Then there were some issues raised, I think later, the U.S. Attorney Bergman, is that right?
Berman.
Essentially said that part of the reason that they never brought charges was that Bill Barr had put pressure on the office not to.
Yes, although I should also note that the actual line assistants, in other words, the assistant U.S. attorneys who are not political appointees working on the case, had concluded that he was not reliable as a witness. I think they had concluded, my understanding is, both from what's public and not, is that they concluded he lied. Michael Cohen had lied to them on certain points. So they just were not willing to go forward with Michael Cohen. They didn't have confidence in it.
Yeah. And so I just think it's worth having all of this history back there too, in terms of how potentially fraught, I guess, he is as a witness coming forward now. And this case is finally brought by the Manhattan DA. And especially since, as you noted, what he's testifying to really does need to be corroborated by other things. And Trump's contention is that he was being paid for legal services rendered. And Michael Cohen is basically there to say, no, this was all sham invoices that were there to provide a vehicle for reimbursement for this payment that I made for my home equity loan to Stormy Daniels. Now, the one person, so obviously there's the sham invoices that can corroborate that. But the other person that could corroborate that is Alan Weisselberg. But of course, they're not going to put him on the stand. And he's been charged with perjury by the Manhattan DA. And do you want to talk about that and how, because I believe that the prosecutors aren't allowed to make that known to the jury, like why he's not there.
That's right. And with good reason. That is essentially distracting the jury from the issues in the case. I mean, that's not something that's being proven. It's, Donald Trump is not implicated in that in any way. And it's not proper for the jury to be considering whether a witness has been convicted of perjury or not. But essentially, Weisselberg's not being cooperative with Manhattan DA at all. Some people have argued that that's because he's receiving, various income and so forth from the Trump organization. That, people are making arguments about that. But what we do know is that he was charged and I believe he pled guilty and essentially has been found, via his guilty plea, guilty of perjury. So he is not somebody that the Manhattan DA is going to rely on, because they could rely on him at best to try to say what would be, only admit what he had to and try to spin it in a way that was helpful to Trump. Now that may make you wonder, well, why isn't Trump calling him? Okay. Why isn't he a defense witness? And the short answer to that is if they called him as a defense witness, he'd have to admit the pieces of this that are, helpful to the prosecution, or else he'd risk another perjury charge. And realistically, he's at best a mixed bag for that reason. So from the defense perspective, having him not there and having the prosecution not meet their burden potentially by relying solely on Michael Cohen and Michael Cohen's essentially say so regarding what Alan Weisselberg told him at the time, which ordinarily wouldn't come into evidence. We could talk about that and why that's coming into evidence. But that is, I think, an advantage for the defense here. So that's why we're not hearing from Alan Weisselberg. And it's also why essentially what you're getting is the prosecution trying to get in statements from Alan Weisselberg via Michael Cohen.
Yeah, I want to hear about how those statements are coming in. And the other piece of corroboration that also, just to mention before we get into those weeds, is, Lordy, there are tapes.
Yes, there is a tape. That's what I alluded to before recording. That is obviously very helpful to the Manhattan DA. But like I said, it goes to certain issues and not others. It doesn't go to the falsification of business records, which is, of course, what the crime is here. But it goes to the hush money payment scheme. It's another example, in my view, of something you and I, Asha, discussed last week, which is Trump's unwillingness to concede points that I think are very readily provable by the prosecution. Actually makes the prosecution's case stronger because he's trying to deny the obvious. It's like if you're a drug dealer and they're charging you with conspiracy. You actually didn't conspire with anyone, but you're trying to deny that you're a drug dealer when they found meth in your car or whatever, and you got like a pound of meth in your trunk. Like you can try to deny it. Like I had no idea the meth was there, but it's much stronger to try to fight only on the piece of it that is actually, very strong for you legally in my hypothetical on the conspiracy count. And here for Trump, he would be much stronger just essentially saying, yeah, there was a hush money scheme. I paid this not for an election law violation. It was because I didn't want bad press. And I had no idea how this was being recorded in the books and records of the Trump organization because I'm not an accounting or bookkeeping type person. That's just not my thing. I signed some checks. That's all I did. That is a much more viable defense, but that's not what he's doing. And so we're getting a lot of this evidence in about, like you said, the recording and other things proving up the fact of the hush money scheme.
Right. And one of the most damning things that Cohen testified to was that Trump's focus was primarily on the election.
Correct. In fact, he wanted to push this off.
Basically, the election was the date certain after which, it no longer becomes relevant because he says, if I win, then it's no longer relevant, which kind of gets to the fact that he thought that this would actually impact the candidacy itself. And if I lose, then I don't really care anymore. And just to drive home the point of his defense, which is I'm protecting my family and I didn't want to hurt, Melania. According to Cohen, he says, what about Melania? And Trump's answer is, well, whatever. I wouldn't be on the market very long. Presumably, I guess, if she left him. I mean, in other words, he was not super concerned about how she would react to this if it eventually came out.
Yeah, I think Cohen's testimony on that is obviously very helpful to the prosecution. To me, the most important piece of evidence or testimony, I should say, from Cohen is really something that has been a blip to people, but in which he essentially said that Trump was on board with disguising the false payments in the books and records of the Trump organization. But on both of these points, you're recounting what Trump allegedly said about Melania and Trump's alleged statements about the books and records of the Trump organization are, of course, just Cohen's say so, convicted liar, fraudster, all of these other issues. And like I said, all of this backup that we have is on other points. And so one thing that I'll just say to everyone is, let's just get to the evidentiary issue that we were talking about before. Typically speaking, in court, you're not supposed to be able to testify about what other people said. You're supposed to be able to testify about what you saw, what you heard. But generally speaking, if I go to court and testify about what Asha told me, that's called hearsay. And it's something that's kept out because it's considered unreliable. Let's have Asha here talk about whatever happened from her perspective, not have me recount that. But one exception to the hearsay rule is where the opponent has made these statements. So here, the people of the state of, or the people of Manhattan essentially are bringing this case. The Manhattan DA's office bringing this case against Donald Trump. He's the party opponent. So Donald Trump's statements are admissible. They're non-hearsay when offered by other people. So here, Michael Cohen can say anything that he alleges Trump said. In addition to that, as part of that rule, people who are in a common, joint venture with that person, including a conspiracy, also are essentially, those count as non-hearsay admissions. So, for example, if me and Asha are conspiring and ultimately I am indicted, the prosecutors can introduce Asha's statements that are made during the course of that conspiracy. That's how Alan Weisselberg's statements are coming in via Michael Cohen. So, so
he's an unindicted co-conspirator?
Essentially. You don't have to. There's
because they're not charging conspiracy. That seems like a very loose.
So in some jurisdictions, I'll say, for example, so it depends from circuit to circuit. And in the circuit that I practice most I've had most experience federally, the Seventh Circuit, government's actually required to prepare a written submission before the trial detailing the evidence of the alleged conspiracy. Before there can be a finding by the judge that there is a conspiracy for purposes of allowing co-conspirator statements in. It's called a Santiago proffer. But that's not the case in most federal jurisdictions. And in state jurisdictions, it can be even more loose. It's a jurisdiction by jurisdiction thing, but this is a common rule of evidence in state and federal court. Defense counsel, and I'll count myself now as a current defense counsel, it can be very frustrating when the government alleges a conspiracy very loosely and with with evidence that you think wouldn't hold up, certainly not beyond a reasonable doubt. And they're able to get in all sorts of hearsay evidence. You can't cross-examine Alan Weisselberg because he's not there. And they put things in your client's mouth, but of course your client has a right to remain silent. The only way he can refute it is to take the stand.
And is the idea of letting in co-conspirator statements that if you were to compel them to testify, they could take the fifth? Is that it's because there's no other way? Is it sort of the same thought behind the party opponent piece?
It's certainly a similar thought, regarding that versus the party opponent piece. I guess what I would just say is, part of it, I think, and I'm not an expert on how they came up with the rules of evidence a bazillion years ago, but I do think part of it may go to the fact that the statements presumably are against that person's interest. So, there's already an exception for statements against interest, which is narrowly construed. And I think the idea here is when somebody admits something, there's either a waiver component to it, which is the case when you take a legal position. And similarly, there's a reliability to a statement that you're making that perhaps you would rather not have made, because it's actually not in your favor. So I think that may be part of it. But in either event, the bottom line is that they are admissible, and it's how the prosecution is getting in a lot of evidence here. I will say that, when we talked about it's complicated in the beginning about Cohen, I do think the jury is going to have trouble focusing on these specific statements unless the defense does a very careful job on cross and in really focusing solely on the portions of his testimony that are just totally his say so. And I think the problem is not only does Cohen give him so much to work with that most lawyers are not going to be disciplined enough not to just use every greatest hit of every crazy thing he's ever said about Trump, but also, and all of his obviously other baggage, but also there's just the client himself, right? Donald Trump, as we both know, he must hate Cohen and must be wanting to do everything he can to destroy Cohen because Cohen is ridiculing him every single day. Yeah.
So you're saying a disciplined defense lawyer would surgically attack the uncorroborated hearsay statements and basically drive home to the jury, like, basically, this is all based on your say-so.
Correct.
Is that what you're saying? Like, just kind of say, like, okay, and so that then they can, in closing, basically say, listen, these two key elements of this case have been based entirely on Michael Cohen claiming that Alan Weisselberg said something.
Right. Or that Trump said something. And
or that Trump said something.
Right. And we all know he's basically, he needs
he hates Trump.
He hates Trump. To make a living, he needs to go after Trump. Like, that's literally his entire existence right now is focused on that, would be the way the argument would go. Yeah. I mean, one issue that lawyers have in general is that they like hearing themselves talk, and they presume that other people want to hear what they have to say. And so they talk on and on and on. They say too much. And I think there's this sense in trial that, like, you don't want to, if you don't make an argument, or if you leave any bullet in your gun, like, maybe that would have made the difference. The problem is when you make 50 points, if your best point was 0.4 and 0.17, the jury is going to miss those because they're falling asleep because they've been like hearing a lawyer drone on for hours and hours. So the cross of Michael Cohen might go on for several hours. There may be some amazing nuggets in there, and the jury is going to miss them. And so if you spend all this time going surgically through everything that you possibly can to impeach Michael Cohen, he's going to lose the power of it. And really what you want to do is say, look, I know we've heard about recordings and we've seen documents, Mr. Cohen, but as to this point, you don't have a document to back that up, do you? You know, there's no email between you and Donald Trump. There's no writing that Donald Trump signed saying this point, right? You don't have that. You do have that, sir? Okay. Did you have a recording of yourself and Alan Weisselberg having this conversation? Where's that? You know, focusing on those points. And so we're supposed to believe you, right? That's your testimony that's true. Well, you've testified before and you lied during that. You know, you could just destroy him with that like level of cross-examination and sit down. And I think that's much more effective, but I don't expect that to happen. I expect all of those little, well, they're not little, all those key issues with the case to get lost in the broader attack. I don't think Trump would let that incisive of a cross happen.
I was just about to say that I think if the defense lawyers actually did a surgical cross like the one that you described, Trump would be pissed because he's living vicariously through his defense lawyers. And I think we talked about this with Stormy Daniels, that there's a savvy way to do it, and then there's a way where Trump's ego feels better. And these are not necessarily aligned.
Exactly.
And so, you know, and especially since, you know, under his gag order, he can't attack Cohen. So he is really relying on the defense lawyers to pummel him and, you know, demean him and do all this stuff. Which, you know, I think depending on how the jury feels about Michael Cohen can really backfire too. Like if they've come to like him, if they have been inclined to believe him, like a lot of badgering and hounding and, you know, being a jerk may actually turn them off.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you know, Cohen, despite all of his flaws, is a very likable person. I mean, I've appeared on his podcast. I assume you have as well.
I have, yeah. He's so funny.
He's a funny guy, you know. He's you know, affable kind of guy. He's a character, but you know, some people like lovable characters, right? I mean, people love, you know what, Joe Pesci or Danny DeVito or all sorts of people are going to be characters, but people enjoy watching them in movies and pay money to see them. So I think, you know, there's a danger of that. I just think, as you said, you know, Trump is not focused on winning this trial in the way that I understand winning this trial. In other words, when clients hire me to win a trial for them, like they're riding, their whole existence to them is riding on beating that charge, right? And defeating the government, and that their whole life is focused on that in that moment. And if I tell them this is what we need to do to win, they're going to listen to that because they want to win. I don't think Trump is focused on winning this trial. He may truly believe that it's all rigged, but it's more likely that he thinks he gets some political benefit of turning it into a circus, trying to distract from the issues, using it to raise money, and that he's just going to, you know, defy them when he becomes president for life or whatever he thinks he's going to become.
Well, we'll see.
We will see, indeed. I do think, but I do think that, right now things are looking very good for the Manhattan DA's office. And I think it's because Trump is making their life easy. He's already a difficult defendant to defend if you are a defense attorney. And, he's forcing his lawyers to go hard. We talked about this last week, right, against Stormy Daniels. And so far this week, the prosecution is hitting the right tones. They're restraining Michael Cohen, and they're putting in this whole story that you talked about earlier.
So looking ahead, what is the defense's play then? Like, what's their best, apart from the cross of Michael Cohen? I mean, Trump is not going to testify.
Trump's not going to testify. I don't think they're going to have much of a defense case. I mean, the defense case that you would want to put on is you'd want to put on Trump Organization folks to say that we had this scheme to disguise these payments as payments for legal services, but that was done without Trump's knowledge. We cooked it up. Like, we were all in a meeting with. I mean, all you need is a witness to come in and say, "Yeah, me, Michael Cohen, and Alan Weisselberg sat around a table. We all decided this together. In fact, we all said, right, we're not going to tell Donald Trump. We're going to just keep this amongst ourselves to take care of this for him." No one is coming in to say that. First of all, that would probably be perjury. Okay, so that's one issue. But secondly, like the Trump Organization witnesses have generally been for the prosecution. The ones who aren't are sitting this out or have committed perjury, like Mr. Weisselberg. There doesn't, as far as we know, there's no sort of secret witness who's going to come in and turn this all on its head. And so really it's just a lot of cross-examination and then argument that the government didn't meet its burden. Like, whenever a defendant doesn't take the stand, it all becomes to this hypothetical about, did the government meet its burden?
So let me ask you this. How close does the nexus have to be in terms of the government proving Trump's knowledge of the falsification? Is it enough that he knew that using legal services as a cover was just a sham and just a cover, to get Michael Cohen reimbursed? Because there's a lot of mechanics that are going on behind this that actually form the basis of these counts, right? So, Cohen submits the sham invoices. These get recorded and paid out. Then they get recorded in like another ledger. And I mean, I doubt that Trump was like literally poring over the ledgers, or, he was not the one recording the entries. Alan Weisselberg was. So I'm just curious if that's an avenue and that either the defense can play up or is a vulnerability, or if the fact that Trump is like, yeah, we'll make this work. We'll cover it up. Talk to Alan. If that's enough to kind of sweep in these actual transactions that form the basis of the indictment.
Yeah, it's a really good question. You've kind of hit on a point that the defense really focused on in their opening. So there's something in New York called accessory liability. That's what they call it there. There's forms of that in other state law and federal law. So other states that I've practiced in and certainly federally. So when you think of whether someone did something, they don't always have to do every piece of that crime themselves in order for it to be a crime. In other words, you may not wire the money yourself, like you may cause somebody else to do it. You may not transmit the lies yourself in a fraud, for example. You may not carry out every portion of a bank robbery. I'm just giving you an examples of different crimes in which there are different people who might be involved, but every one of those people will have some layer of liability. So in New York, if you cause someone else to commit a crime, for example, you are liable for that under accessory liability. So the defense really used that term and kind of hearkened to it there in the opening. I thought the focus of that made a lot of sense. I thought the way in which they described it was not helpful. I don't like using those lawyer terms when I describe things to juries. I mean, I think our listeners know how I describe things to them. I'm very similar when I'm describing things to a jury, so I wouldn't describe it that fashion. But the one other issue for prosecutors here is I think at the end of the day, they will be trotting out essentially accessory liability and basically say, look, obviously they can't prove that Trump was actually involved in those false statements. He was in the White House at the time. Okay. He was actually president at the time, but they have to basically say that when he signed those checks and he had those conversations with Cohen, he was setting in motion events that were taking place. And he, the evidence is there to show that he knew that he was going to set that in motion and cause other people to do those things. That has to be their argument. But I hope, by the way, your question, which is just so right on point, helps people see kind of the fact that there are some issues with the prosecution, even though we're talking about, I think rightfully so, the fact that the prosecution has the advantage in this trial.
In some ways, this is just occurring to me now. Does some of Michael Cohen's testimony also offer a defense to Trump on this point that, look, this was not a concern for him after he became president? Even if you were to credit Michael Cohen to say, he definitely didn't want this to come out before, like, he also made it clear that once the election was over, either way, it was no longer a concern for him. Why would he have even cared? And by the way, we know that he didn't care because he actually, at that point, wrote a check to Cohen himself. Because I think like 2 of the checks are like directly from Trump.
Right. So, great question. And I would just say that one standard piece of any cross-examination you do of a witness like this would be what I call the limits of knowledge piece. Limits of knowledge. And if you had the long version, let's say, Trump rejects the short and, it's very incisive, very focused cross-examination. You do a longer cross. You would actually also have a whole cross of all the things Cohen didn't see, all the things that Cohen didn't allege because Cohen's not saying that Trump did this, did that. Like, he wasn't hands-on on this. Even you, Mr. Cohen, aren't saying that Trump did this. You didn't testify he did that, right? You never saw him do this. You didn't see him do that. He wasn't here. He wasn't there. Like, there's just so much stuff that Cohen, through his testimony, essentially establishes that Trump didn't do that is actually very, very powerful for the defense as well. It's probably less powerful than the points that I mentioned earlier. And really, this is all judgment call stuff, for people who are actually trying this case and are in the weeds in terms of how much of that they put on. But yeah, I think there's a lot to work with for the defense. They just have fundamental problems, and it's always hard. As I was saying, as somebody who has defeated prosecutors on the defense side, it's very, very hard to do it, just generally speaking. But yeah, I mean, they've got a lot to work with here. So, Asha, you're a mom. How was Mother's Day? What happened?
It was a good Mother's Day. The weather was beautiful. I have a few traditions I've developed on Mother's Day. So we have brunch together, me and my kids. Frankly, I'm usually the one cooking brunch, but but I made pancakes and
very typical Mother's Day, by the way. You are serving your kids.
So,
that's great.
I mean, they have. There have been prior years where they've gotten up and made stuff, but I was just in the mood to make my famous lemon ricotta blueberry pancakes, which are really good. So I made those, and then I normally plant my garden on Mother's Day. And we usually go to the nursery and pick out tomato plants and whatever. I didn't get to do that this year because I was already behind on kind of cleaning out the debris from my garden from last year. So I ended up doing that. So it's now ready to go for planting. And then, they brought me some gifts and a card. My boyfriend got me a gift and cards. We opened those. And then my boyfriend and I went down to the city for dinner, and then we saw a show.
Wow. That was quite a Mother's Day.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that was a pretty awesome Mother's Day. Very impressive.
Yeah.
I thought we had a good Mother's Day. It's eerily similar to yours. which is like, it's like almost it's weird, right? Because so I always do a lot for my wife on Mother's Day, because I feel like it's this big thing. It's like, we honor you on Mother's Day. So it's like one of my things. Like, so we did, like, she likes to sleep in, and I never do that. I always wake up very early and do all this stuff. I'm more of a night owl, but I've forced myself over the years to wake up early and get things done. So I slept in with her and watched TV shows with her that she wanted to do. And then I took her and my mother-in-law and my mother out for brunch, very similar to you.
Oh, so nice. So you advanced planned, because you got to make brunch reservations.
Yes. It was like one of these places, they charge you like 4 times the typical amount.
Yeah.
But there's like a buffet, and it's very, they did all this, whatever. You have your omelet station and your, all that stuff. Right. So it was very fun, and they all loved that. And we had orchids for our moms, which was, which my wife picked out, which was a lot of fun, and cards and this and that. And then we spent the afternoon gardening. It was like it was very eerily similar. The only difference is I did not take her, and I feel like now I feel inadequate, because she's like, this is the best Mother's Day ever. And then but I did not take her to the city for a show.
Now she's going to listen to this episode.
Oh my God.
But you didn't take me to dinner and a show. Though, to be fair, I actually told my boyfriend like a month ago, like, I was like, I want to see the show on Mother's Day. And he was like, okay.
That's the easiest thing as a guy, when like the woman like actually tells you, like, do this. This is what I want. Just do it. And this show, I just have to give a shout out. It's some classmates of mine from Princeton, from my class in 96, have since formed a theater company that's been incredibly successful. They make, they write these and direct these amazing shows. And this one they had written and directed, called The Hello Girls, which premiered like many years ago, but they reprised it for one weekend in New York, which is about the first female switchboard operators in World War I. Where they were first getting signals out into the field, and the soldiers couldn't operate them. So they literally got telephone switchboard operators from AT&T Bell, made them into, had them join the army, and like sent them out. And it's a musical based on that, which is really cool. And I wanted to see it again. So I just wanted to do a shout out for that, because it wasn't just like any That's
show.
Really cool. That's awesome. That sounds like a wonderful Mother's Day.
It was a wonderful Mother's Day, except I do have to say that, my family and I have like a family chat, like me, my parents, my sister, our kids, we're all on a family chat. So I was the first one to wish everybody, my sister and my mom, Mother's Day. And then my mom says to me, Happy Mother's Day, any special plans for the day? And I like say what my plans are. Then she says to my sister, Happy Mother's Day, Maynard. You are a wonderful mother, and I'm very proud of you. Keep up the good work. So then I'm like, what about me? And so
she's like, you got enough praise. You got enough going on.
I know. It was just like regressing back into like, sibling rivalry. Because I was like, well, where's my, laudatory text?
Wow. Well, I give you all the laudatory text here, Asha. We honor you today. Honoring Mother's Day.
Thank you. Thank you.
MSW Media.